Why did you decide learning Chinese, or actually Cantonese?
I was living in Hong Kong I worked there. I was working for an American company in Hong Kong, and I guess most of the people that I worked with never bothered to learn Chinese. They just used English all the time. But me, I had some Chinese friends, and I also wanted to learn Chinese because I lived there, like to go to the market, to do some shopping, to do restaurants, similar to why I tried to learn some Vietnamese here in Vietnam. So when I was living in Hong Kong, I just took some basic classes so I could communicate a little bit. And I think when you study a language, you learn more about the culture of the place that you're living.
Yeah.
So I did it for that reason.
Was it difficult?
Well, of course, Chinese is difficult because it was the first time I studied a tonal language. And in Cantonese, there are even more tones than in Mandarin. I think there are 7 tones. So some people say Cantonese is even more difficult than Mandarin.
But I've heard about that.
But the grammar was pretty easy. Like the verbs are, like Vietnamese, not so complicated like English and European languages. So some things were difficult and some things were easy. But when I went out and I practiced my Cantonese and people could understand me, it made me feel very good. And many people are worried that the writing system is very difficult.
Okay.
So with reading Chinese, it was easier for me because I already knew some Chinese characters.
Oh, wow. For me, reading skill and writing skill very difficult.
Yeah.
And even Cantonese writing skill harder than Mandarin.
Right.
So how do you think about it?
Yeah, I didn't even know that, but because when I was living in Hong Kong, I just used the Hong Kong writing system. And it was only later, after I left Hong Kong, that I learned that in Mandarin or mainland China, they use an easier writing system. They make it's kind of the same character, but they make it easier with fewer strokes and less complication. So I don't know. I just learned the hard one, but I didn't know it was the hard one. So I didn't know that there was a choice.
That's good. Someone said if you learn the hard one, when you like to learning Mandarin, a simple like Chinese, it's easier for beginner. Better than others learner to learn Chinese.
So maybe if I ever study Mandarin, it will be easier because I learned many of the more difficult characters. Although I forgot many of them, so I would probably have to start at the beginning again. And it would take a long time to catch up to your skill.
How long have you been studying Chinese?
Well, I don't study Chinese anymore. I studied Chinese about 5 years ago when I was in Hong Kong. And I studied for just a short while, probably only about 3 or 4 months. I think I took Cantonese Part 1 and Cantonese Part 2, and each of those parts was about 6 weeks. But it was very intensive. It was every day going to class.
In Part 1, you say American criticism of China are a little stupid. So can you talk more about that? Why do you think so?
Well, mostly because I don't trust the U.S. government very much. And I don't trust the U.S. media very much. When I listen to news on CNN or when I read the big newspapers, they're not telling a story for me. They're usually not telling the complete story of why something is. And especially now, there is so much suspicion between the United States and China. And the American government, they care mostly about American business. And the American newspapers care mostly about American business, but they don't really help ordinary people like me. And so I don't trust them. I don't think when they tell us a story, it's what they want us to believe. It's not necessarily the truth. So, for example, we're told in the United States that Chinese people have no freedom of religion, for example. And that's not really true. There are churches, there are mosques, there's all sorts of religion in China. We're told the same thing about Vietnam, actually, that there's no freedom of religion in Vietnam, but there is. I see many churches, I see mosques, I see people practicing religion. And I think one thing that they do in China that they don't tell us in the United States is that you cannot join a religion until you're 18 years old. So they think that it's not good for somebody to decide on a religion until they're an adult. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. But to many Americans, they want to get children to, believe in God at an early age. Yeah. And, children cannot make that decision for themselves. So the Chinese, restrict religious membership to people 18 years and older. And I think that's okay. So that's just one small example, but we're not told in the United States very accurate information about China. And I think many times we are told lies. I'm not an expert on China, but I'm very suspicious of what my government and the media tells me to believe, because they're not looking out for me.
Get it? Yeah. So about the the one-child policy. Why do China change the one-child policy? Yeah, because they need to have more people to work to support the economy, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. They just relaxed the policy, I think, in 2016. But the one-child policy is another good example of misinformation that we Americans are given about China. So we were told, the Chinese government is so awful, it's so horrible, it restricts the number of children that people can have. Well, the Chinese government introduced the one-child policy in 1978, and the reason for that was that they began a war against poverty. They wanted to eliminate poverty. And when the population was growing too rapidly, that made it very difficult to control poverty. So in 1978, they announced that policy. And guess what? Just earlier this year, they announced that they had eliminated extreme poverty. And I think that's a good thing that happened in China.
I think so.
The United States, 10 years before the one-child policy, in 1964, the American government also introduced a war on poverty. President Johnson called it that. But that didn't do anything. There's still a lot of poverty in the United States, and people have too much debt. People have not enough money. They don't have security. And especially after the COVID pandemic, we see many people who are struggling, and the government isn't helping them very much. So I think the Chinese war on poverty that started in 1978 was more successful than the American war on poverty that started in 1964. But I just don't believe what the government says. The government has lied to me all of my life. So why do I believe what they are telling me about China?
Does it happen everywhere in the world, not in the country, even in Vietnam? So
yeah, but too many Americans, I think, and too many Americans believe too much of what the government and the newspapers tell them, because they're not telling the truth. We know that.
Thank you, Edward. It has been fun to interview you.
Thank you, An. It was really fun to talk to you in part 1 and part 2 about Chinese and about learning Chinese and Chinese culture. And I want to invite everybody listening that they can put comments on the comment page or join us on Facebook. And tell us what you want to hear in the future. Thank you all.